Hello there, and thanks for tuning in once again. I'm Howard Bentham, and this is OxTalks, the podcast powered by OxLEP, the local enterprise partnership for Oxfordshire. During these podcasts, I speak with some quite brilliant and innovative leaders discussing current issues in business. Each and every one of my guests is always keen to highlight the critical support that OxLEP offers and how it could be vital in helping your company or organisation's future development. As you'd expect, our spotlight is on Oxfordshire's businesses in these podcasts, but naturally you may well be enjoying OxTalks wherever you are. With that in mind, please feel free to join in the conversation and share any feedback. Our social media is the easiest way to get in touch. We are at Oxfordshire LEP on X and Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership on LinkedIn. You can raise a question for future discussions or leave your thoughts on the topics of conversation. Please use the email address on the podcast description, and we look forward to hearing from you. In this edition, we'll be hearing how to embrace diversity in the workplace, exploring the impact and integration of equality, diversity, and inclusion into different sectors of business and enterprise, as well as sharing practical advice and guidance for leaders. The three terms, equality, diversity, and inclusion, are often placed together, but clearly cover three very different areas and nuance. Equality is something all fair-minded people, one would hope, would strive for in life as well as in work. But how do you make a competitive working environment equal and fair for all? Diversity picks up on this idea of fair representation in terms of, and this is not an exhaustive list, sex, gender, race, disability, religion, sexual orientation, and socio-economic background. What are the benefits of being such a broad church? But how do you stop that becoming just a tick box list? The inclusion part, though, is key to making everyone feel listened to and part of the whole. The organisation acting as a warm and embracing environment for divergence of thought and variations of humankind. It's a great aim to strive for. However, leaders have to take decisions, and not everyone will feel that decision works for them. Many organisations have a strong commitment to ED&I, and potential employees look to align their values with those of the organisation in the recruitment process. However, is it truly possible to level the playing field at work with just too many conflicting angles to allow equality, diversity, and inclusion to function effectively? We hear many business commentators saying equality, diversity, and inclusion is simply the right thing to do. What are the metrics for measuring if ED&I are actually good for business, and can that claim be backed up by evidence? There is much to discuss, from female representation in the workplace and gender pay gaps to the ethnicity mix in the boardroom, and why some groups in society are simply overlooked. Our guest charged with putting all this into context and sharing with us best practice in everything equality, diversity, and inclusion is the first ever ED&I lead at Aston Martin. She has a fascinating background that includes hip-hop dancing, time working in Ghana and New York, as well as earning a master's in international law at Oxford Brookes University. I'm delighted to welcome to OxTalks, Laura Ayoade. Laura, great to speak with you. Before we delve into ED&I head-on, let's learn a little bit about you, first of all, if we can. As I understand it, you were raised here in the county and still live locally. Give us a quick potted life history about the hip-hop, the teaching, the time overseas, and how that's ended up with you as ED&I lead at James Bond's car manufacturer of choice.
Sure. So, yeah, I was born in Oxford and still live in Bicester locally, so not too far from home. I went to university to study dance and realised very quickly when I was in a contemporary school that wasn't for me. I didn't want to be a carbon copy on stage, and stage dance wasn't where I was kind of headed. It wasn't my passion, and I really wanted to study a dance that was from a culture, from a place of meaning. My interest through school was the civil rights, so I loved history. I loved doing kind of the Black civil rights and some of the kind of histories through that from slavery and that trajectory. So I chose to transfer to London and do a hip-hop dance degree especially so that I can kind of get into the culture behind it. And obviously that comes from a space of kind of racial justice first and foremost. So that's kind of been where I've wanted to head in terms of my trajectory, in terms of ED&I particularly. At the time, ED&I wasn't really a space, I suppose, so I couldn't kind of pinpoint what job I would do eventually. But I stayed with that trajectory and worked out in the United States, in New York, with the Hip Hop Dance Conservatory, danced in Broadway Dance Center for some time and danced over there kind of 4 years in the summers. And also in other spaces. So I went to Ghana for a month and did like African contemporary dance and like still stuck with that kind of racial justice trend of like all different cultural dances. I then went on to do a range of master's degrees, because why not? I did a double master's in international performance research and focused again on kind of hip hop as a core identity and understanding kind of the performance, so the performativity of just all kinds of things from protest through to kind of like just general happenings, and wrote my thesis on how the criminalization of hip hop impacted Black and ethnic minority like people, including Latino people in New York City, and looked at all kinds of things from the architecture of the city and all sorts of stuff that went with that. And then I did a master's in international human rights law because
There's a bit of a leap there.
It is, and it made sense because no one really gave me enough kudos for the arts. Like the arts is still like a space that really suffers in terms of, okay, cool, you've done a dance degree, what are you going to do with that? So I looked at policy and I looked at law, and I applied for both, and I thought about what was best in terms of what I wanted to get out of it. And I found that policy is great, but it can be changed and altered so many times by lots of different people. Law is like your foundation, your legislation. It's harder to change. It cements kind of in our society, like the foundations and the basics. So I did international human rights law because it kind of led on from that racial justice piece. We've covered lots of things from like globalization and development, international humanitarian law, which I'm deeply interested in. So my kind of day-to-day interests would be things like Gaza and stuff like that right now, Ukraine and other spaces that are in really, in war and genocide essentially. So I did the human rights law so that I could kind of look into the humanitarian law pieces as well, which covers the 4 major crimes, crimes against humanity, war crimes, aggression and genocide. And it was what interested me. And I did my thesis again related to hip hop. And I looked into intellectual property law and how people had the rights to protect their forms of cultural expression. Unfortunately, globally, the only type of choreography protected is for stage. And that puts in its own issues because the people that are often afforded space on stage are not people of colour. So that kind of showed the racial injustices in those spaces. So I used actually Australia as a key example because Aboriginals are the only space afforded that protection by law for their forms of cultural identity and expression rather than on stage. So I utilised that as my foundation for arguing the point, which was, it was interesting. And I had two professors arguing over my thesis, one wanting to fail me and one wanting to give me a first, and I got the first, thankfully, which led me into kind of my ED&I career. And I kind of loopholed in through it. I taught through my master's degrees to help pay for them because they're not cheap. So I was teaching in secondary education mostly through performing arts and that kind of dance space in Oxford, so locally again. And then went to work for a local company, Unipart, you probably know it, as their corporate and social responsibility lead. So working under the head of CSR, which happened during a monumental time in our kind of history. It was COVID pandemic. I started there in March of 2020, 5 days before lockdown, and also followed on by Floyd, which happened in the May of 2020. And I don't think that murder would have been as significant as it was if we had been locked down and watching it live on TV, which was horrific for so many people and very traumatic. So that kind of led me into wanting to do more in that space, and went on to work for Business in the Community, who are the biggest and largest, oldest responsible business network in the UK. Prince Charles at the time, now King Charles, was the founding member. And we are essentially inclusion consultants, I suppose. We are given a range of organisations to consult on best practice, and including kind of running the competitions like Times Top 50 for women, for example, and helping grade those and set that up. So I was responsible for writing some of those questions a few years ago and benchmarking that, which then saw me work alongside some of the greatest corporates and thought, maybe let's go in-house for a bit and see what that's like from a different angle. So went back in-house, similar to Unipart, I suppose, automotive industry originally, and found Aston Martin came up, and they actually signed with Business in the Community at the same time as me taking a role with them, which was coincidental. I had no part in it. But yeah, went on to Aston Martin purely because I felt that I could make a massive difference there. The kind of racial injustice side is still really important to me. It's something that I kind of look at in my free time. I still work for Stand Up to Racism UK. I'm still interested in some of the kind of activist groups. Roads Must Fall in Oxford is a big one. But obviously there's other elements to diversity and inclusion that are really key in business, and Aston Martin has a range of focuses at the moment. So I felt that those focuses were something I could align with and work on.
Just hearing your backstory there, that there's clearly a passion for fairness in what you're saying. Was there a moment, a key incident that's driven that?
I think I can't pinpoint one, but I can pinpoint many kind of examples. And I think because my passion for hip hop dance was what kind of I practice in my everyday life, things like when I went out on the weekends, I'd go to clubs that played hip hop music and would be surrounded by a lot of diverse people. So most of my close friends at the time were from an ethnically minoritized background, mostly Black British, Black international as well. And I watched incidences happen on a daily basis that were just not fair at all. Just different expectations on them than there were for me. How I definitely had like privileged opportunities in the same situations as them. And it didn't kind of sit well with me. So it was a series of events that made me feel like there was more to be done in that space.
I guess in the spirit of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, what challenges or obstacles did you face early in your career, and how did you overcome them to focus on ED&I?
I think one of the things was like, I didn't really know what ED&I was. Like there wasn't a specific space. It's obviously exploded on the scene since Floyd and since other kind of things that have happened globally and UK as well. And so I think navigating like a career in a space that's not maths or science or English, those subjects that you get taught at school. And I feel careers currently isn't, it wasn't when I was at school. It wasn't very great in foreseeing other opportunities other than like become a teacher, become a doctor, those kind of things. I think it's a lot better now and is improving. So I think that was a massive hurdle, hence why I probably did 4 degrees rather than just one to get to what I got to. I think also given that so obviously ED&I ranges, and we'll probably go into a bit more of the protected characteristics and the things that it covers. My background is wholeheartedly in racial justice, and obviously I am not a racial minority for the UK. I am white British. I'm Oxford born and bred, so my parents, so my grandparents, and so most of my great-grandparents. So we're like blue through our veins. So it's hard sometimes navigating with people that don't feel like I am legitimate and backing that space, like I should be a person of colour. And actually I often talk about the fact that the systems of racism, especially in the UK, because our racism is more subtle than some of the spaces in the world, and it's very systematic and systemic. Those systems were not set up by people of colour. They were set up by colonial spaces and people that look like me. And in dismantling them, you're going to need everybody to dismantle them. It's like working for women's equality without involving men. It just doesn't work. Like you have to have both sides. So I feel quite passionate about standing my ground in that space and supporting that space towards fairness.
I gave one view on the definition of equality, diversity and inclusion in the introduction. Let's hear your thoughts on it. Do you view them as distinct entities?
Definitely. I think they've been grouped together so often that they become a buzzword and a fad, and that is literally destroying the industry because people are thinking, okay, it had its time and now it's not as important, when actually in an economic crisis, in a global, post-global pandemic, and in multiple wars that are happening, it's more important than ever, because those are the things that make people feel like they belong somewhere, and that is the inclusion piece. It is the ultimate aim, right? To feel like you belong, to feel that it is your space, and it's hard to achieve. the diversity piece is what kind of comes first for me. Like it's getting a wide range of people, a variety of people in the space to then make sure that they are included in that space and through fairness and equality and also equity, which I'll talk about in relation to equality. So diversity is just a range of people. And obviously that will look different from different parts of the UK. If you're based in London, like the percentages are higher and more varied. So you should be serving the community, like kind of reflecting the community that you serve. Whereas in Oxford, where we are, like it's a little bit more mixed than say, I don't know, somewhere out in the Cotswolds, but it's not as mixed as London. So you need to be kind of looking at the percentages of people that are there to make sure that you are kind of reflecting that. And that would give you the diversity of the area.
Does that make it different and difficult then when you're trying to do a UK policy, for example? You can almost look at London as another country.
Yeah, you could.
In some respects.
Yeah, and Birmingham and like the other major kind of cities, the hubs. So, I mean, you would aim for best practice and thinking, okay, well, we're, for example, on the kind of gender space or like sex space, you'd look at, okay, we're 48% men, 48% women. We leave a 4% in the middle for kind of trans and non-binary spaces at the moment. And so you'd want to try to reflect that as close as possible. And then if you were a business that was based in like Gaydon, like we are in Warwickshire, you would look at like the metrics for that area to hone in even more detail. So you'd kind of like go into detail there to like show that your metrics match. Or vice versa, if you were looking at like race, for example, and that was much more like varied in London, you would use like the UK overall metrics first, and then you would go, actually, ours are going to be slightly lower than that, and this is the reason, because we sit in this space and that's not our space. So yeah, I think it's fairly easy to kind of show those metrics. They're available through ONS surveys and things like that. Yeah, I don't think it's too difficult to do.
So what are the benefits then of companies aiming for genuine equality, diversity and inclusion at their organisation?
There's so many, and I think it's key to kind of mention like the equality versus the equity piece. My E in my title stands for equity rather than equality, and we chose to go with that because the difference, I would say, is like the equality is getting everybody in the room. Everyone's like around the table has a seat. Equity is giving every person a voice in that room. So making sure that they have what they need to start off in the right position in their place and make sure they're heard at the same level as everybody else. And there's a massive difference in that. There's so many benefits to it, because if you think about having a room of 10 people that all grew up in Oxford and all grew up like with the same kind of schooling or went to the same space, had the same friends and had the same ideas and the same education, when they're problem solving, they're probably going to come out with opportunities that are quite like each other. So you might get one or two like problem solving ideas out of them. But if you put in a range of people and split that 10 people in lots of different ways through race and gender and like all of the different kind of characteristics you can come with, then you will probably, and it's proven that you will probably come out with like a range of ideas much more than you would than targeting a group of people that are quite the same. So of course that can bring more productivity to a business. It gives greater innovation and thought process and diversity of thought in general to be able to create better, problems, like better solutions to problems, especially if you're trying to be more innovative and grow and change things. You're going to need more thought in the space than just the usual. Can
it be truly achievable though, or will it always be a work in progress?
ED&I changes daily, right? So the
staff turnover will affect that as well, won't it?
Of course, yeah. Retention's a really big thing, and it's something to think about. I think it's achievable in some spaces. It depends on the metrics that you place on the business and how achievable those are. And we can talk a little bit about one of the key metrics that's been put out from Aston and how achievable that is, because that is a problematic space at the moment and for various reasons, which I can pinpoint to. And ED&I changes daily, like the makeup of our country changes daily. When you have migration and things from war and stuff like that, refugees and asylum seekers, everything changes. So you're going to have to kind of continuously move that benchmark. But I do think that we can get to a space where we reach like a pinnacle where everybody's at least feeling like they belong, because that is the key issue really. Is like you can throw a bunch of people together that are from all different backgrounds, but unless you put in place all of the things that make them feel like they belong and make them included, then you're not really reaching the ideal inclusion perspective on it. It's the same as like if you build a new housing estate, right? You don't put in the amenities, you don't put in the schooling. Like, where are they going to go? What are they going to do? Like, there's so many things that they need to flourish. Otherwise, they're not going to flourish well.
Just something you said about having good ED&I in the business can improve productivity. You say can.
Yeah.
What are the metrics for measuring that on the bottom line?
Gosh, it's so hard because there's so many things with ED&I that are like, you can't measure by data, but there are things that you can. So first and foremost, the diversity, you can pull the ONS statistics, right, and work on that and understand what is available in your pool of people to hire. So you'd work on those diversity metrics. In terms of like the inclusion piece and like measuring the productivity would be measured later in terms of like, was it successful? Like, the project successful, and what that success measure looks like is different for each organization. So for us, it's building a car or making something kind of fantastic and new, and how successful that is, you can see when it goes to market and whether they kind of sell out. We have really unique spaces where I think for the 110-year anniversary, we did 110 cars. They were sold before they were even made. Like, those are like successes. The inclusion piece is a little bit more nuanced. So it's listening to your people mostly, thinking about their everyday experience and actually wanting to hear how their experience is, the good, the bad, and the ugly, like understanding what's working and what's not working, what to keep and what to change, how to grow as an organization. And there's lots of different things that come out of so many different spaces in terms of like that experience. And for everybody, it will be different. Like, you could have 10 people in the room that are the same, and that experience will still be different. But when you enable much more diversity, that is going to get more complicated and complex in terms of making sure that you have everything in place to make them feel included. But it's a constant, continuous listening cycle of like hearing, accepting feedback, giving feedback, and just making sure that they have a place for that.
On the sort of point of being a competitive working environment and equality or equity, as you've termed it, ultimately someone is going to get that promotion, and a boss will have to make that decision that not everyone will be happy with. So how does that sit in the great world of equity?
People, when you go for a position, the person that's hired should always be based on merit. Positive discrimination is illegal in this country and in most countries. It's not about discriminating and ticking a box and being like, okay, great, we've got a diversity hire, we've got somebody diverse on the board, or whatever level it is. They should still be based on merit. So it's still following a process. Recruitment processes should be rigorous. They should follow a range of things, from like understanding who that person is and whether they are the right add, not cultural fit, but a cultural add to the business, because fit makes you all the same, right? Like, you're just fitting into the same to complete the kind of norm that's there. It should be adding to that. But kind of, yeah, they should be thinking about competency-based and skills-based, not just who the person is, whether they support the same football team as you or whatever it is that becomes biased in that space. That's why a lot of organizations will run things like unconscious bias training for recruitment and recruiting managers, because then they can constantly be aware of what their biases are and then challenge them in a space of recruitment, because those should not be making the decisions for the hires. It should be based on merit.
Let's explore that point a bit more using your role at Aston Martin then. How have you found the automotive sector coming in from, I say, via the world of hip hop?
Yeah.
It's a wonderful transition. I guess it's a different attitude as well to working in the third sector and education sectors where you've got experience.
Yeah, definitely. Like, the corporate world is very different. There's different rules and how you kind of show up in the space and make it work, because obviously there's a business case, whereas within education and things, it's around like so many other metrics, right? Like, making sure children thrive and can reach their full potential. It's very different. I have to say, it's not very me. Like, I enjoy it. Like, I think there's benefits to it. I think what I miss is the kind of justice space and charity space and like driving kind of real global change. But that's something I'm sure I'll get back to one day. But at Aston, I think it's interesting because there's so many things to work on there, and there's great spaces of impact to be made. So it completely drove me to going there. I was thinking, okay, what is the business like? What's it made up of? Okay, it's like 82% white men. Like that's stark in itself, considering we sit near Birmingham and Coventry, like they're massive hubs of diversity, right? So what are we lacking, and what is happening in terms of the hire? So we do have an external commitment of achieving 30% women in leadership by 2030. We're at 17% right now. And it seems quite far off, actually. And that's not an Aston Martin issue, that's an automotive industry issue. There are currently around 22% women in the kind of engineering manufacturing space to pull from. So if there isn't a pool of talent, you can't pull from somewhere else. Like, it doesn't exist, right? So it's thinking about, okay, where does that talent come from? What gets them into those spaces? And actually, it's thinking about schools, and children often make up their minds around their potential careers, or at least the subjects that they want to study by the age of 11. And so it's capturing them before that to think about, okay, could you see yourself in science? Like, is that something that could interest you, or technology? And actually taking it out of the classroom and thinking about, okay, because science is just like your everyday subjects in school become like quite samey, right? But there's so much more to science than just the classroom. So taking Aston Martin to them in a way that's manageable for them to kind of get their teeth into and think, okay, could I do this as a career?
So give us some of the ideas you've come up with, in the policies you've been driving to affect that change.
Sure. So we've partnered with an amazing organisation called Duck2. They work with primary schools mostly, sometimes secondary as well. Their thing is disability and also social mobility. So when we talk about the old class system in the UK, that's where we're looking at with social mobility and thinking about breadlines and things like that. They focus on all of those things in terms of bringing the businesses to the school classroom. So what we did is an Aston Martin module with them. It's filmed with all of our people, and they come in and film it with a script and think about what we want to do as the project. So for us, it's the building of a car. And the children have to work in groups across a 4-week period to kind of create this car. First, it's like the design piece. What do you want it to look like? How cool is it going to be? And within that, they think about lots of different specifics from engineering, from like aerodynamics, how you're going to make it go faster, what mechanism are you going to use to make it propel forward. And then they kind of get all the bits and pieces from around the classroom, or toilet rolls and boxes, to make this car and design it. And essentially their teacher takes them through it. It's a recorded piece, but it can go to any school in the country because it's like recorded and far reaching through Duck2. So we choose to get into the classroom and into the brains of like children from age 5 to 10 early through that opportunity, so they can see, okay, this was really cool. What do I need to do? What do I need to study to get to those spaces? So that was a really good partnership for us. We've also come up with a new STEM strategy and thinking about our outreach. It sits in the learning and development team as well as kind of my space, but looking at lots of opportunities to collaborate with universities, with other secondary schools locally, and further afield. But we focus on local just to be kind of very corporate responsibility and social responsibility, but also we do have a 3 days in the office kind of set period at the moment. We're working through our agile working policy at the moment, but we still will require people on site because of the nature of the business. So it's unfair to ask someone from like Edinburgh to come and work for Aston unless they want to relocate, and then that's their choice. But we're like focused on our local areas first. And then there's lots of other pieces that go into like awareness days and working with our inclusion network and other inclusion events that happen nationally and globally that we can focus on to kind of drive some of the awareness and the change. One of the pieces we did in 2023, I have to think of the year that it happened, is International Women's Day. We opened our Newport Pagnell space to women and girls across the country to come and experience our heritage site. It's incredible. If you ever want to visit Aston, that's the site to go to because they have all of the old cars, the King's Cars service there, all of the kind of traditional pieces, the things that just is so lovely about Aston in terms of its history, really. And we opened up that space for tours and talks and panel events with the F1 team came to. They bought the Alonso car at the time. We had our DBX safety car, like lots of kind of opportunity to actually get inside and feel the product and be part of our discussion in our space, which I think is also key because people will never really understand what it's like to work in a space unless they can see it, feel it, be part of it. So opening our doors a little bit more is really important in kind of gaining interest and building impact in that space.
So once you've hooked young people in, or maybe been on these outreach, they've been out into the community and inspired possibly the next generation, how do you, and you've got them on board, how do you go about fostering an environment where all employees feel valued and listened to?
There's a range of things, really. So I think one of the most powerful internal things is our inclusion network. It was set up in May of 22, so before I started. It was an overarching inclusion network, or what people refer to as an employee resource group, to be the people for our people, essentially. It's run by passionate individuals in the organisation that care about inclusivity and making sure that we celebrate everybody always. And that's grown organically from one formal inclusion network to a 6-piece strand. So we still have the overarching inclusion network with their chair, who's amazing, Matthew Harriet Randall, incredible person who just drives that forward. But we then have these 6 strands that focus on I am gender, so thinking about all things gender. And we have various like success and impactful stories from that space in particular that I've worked on. We have I am well, which focuses on anything well-being. We have I am able, which is anything ability and disability, including neurodivergence, so dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD type things. We have I am Pride, which is our LGBTQ plus network, which partners really closely with Racing Pride and runs all things kind of I am Pride month and beyond. We have I am Embrace, which focuses on race, ethnicity, religion, no religion, belief, and other. So all of that space. And we have, what is the 6th one? I'm just thinking, I am Armed Forces. It's our newest one. So the automotive sector hires disproportionate rates of veterans. So we have quite a lot of veterans because of their skill sets. They really fit well with car manufacturing. So we set up that one 2 months ago because of the need from the business. And those can continue to grow organically, possibly into protected characteristics, possibly beyond into social mobility, parents and carers and those kind of things. And we're building our champion space out at the moment because we're aware that the production floor can't sit at a laptop, can't join meetings as and when is necessary. And so we're looking at how we get champions into those spaces and also our regions, right? Because we're international, making sure that everybody is involved in a space and have a representative to go to hear about some of the kind of awareness days and the pieces that we're doing. So this month is Black History Month. Next month will be Movember. Key dates in the diary that we celebrate and ensure people are included in. And then it's all the other stuff of like, I'm not sure, but we are one of the only big automotive brands that gives every single employee healthcare at all levels. No matter what level you sit at, you have access to private healthcare. Those are really good for feeling included because there's no disparity in terms of, you're like not at the grade to achieve it yet. So that everybody has that. And then just kind of the general kind of fostering of inclusive spaces, such as opportunities to hear them and their experience. We run a series of roundtables, including with our CEO. He listens to some. We've just got a new CEO, as you'll probably be aware, but both our new and old CEOs have already engaged with roundtable opportunities. And yeah, just listening and hearing us and engaging on some of those pieces. So I think that helps foster the inclusion piece.
It's quite a list of the I ams that you're talking about there. I mean, obviously you've got a partnership with Racing Pride. You've touched on there at Aston Martin. Could it be argued though, by highlighting, if you like, the differences, for example, the LGBTQ plus community in this example, that you're potentially leaving other people behind by highlighting the difference, if you like?
And that has been raised at Aston, actually, and it's why our champion spaces are being drawn out. So first and foremost, all our spaces are for those people and allies. So it's not restrictive to somebody who is LGBTQ plus to join I Am Pride. It's for everybody that wants to ally that space and champion that space and support everybody in that space. Secondly, it's understanding that, because that we have heard from, especially from production, that don't access the space as easy and understand its full potential, that I don't fit into any of those boxes. The word comes up that I'm normal. I don't really fit into that. Like, where do I go? Like, what's for me? And I kind of counter that every single person in the business has at the least 3 protected characteristics at any one time. 3. Every single person does in the country. So everybody has a sex. They're either male or female born. Everybody has a race, no matter whether that's a majority race or a minority race. And everybody has an age. So they are 3 protected characteristics under the Equality Act. So you have those 3. And for that reason, the network is there for you, because they are about protected characteristics and beyond. And if there is a group that you foresee being in that space that's not currently there, we can make it. It continues to organically grow, and we want to make sure that there's space for everybody. But equally, we'd expect that you as an employee would want everyone to come to work to feel included. And you might have a person in your team that's LGBTQ+ and is not feeling supported and doesn't really know where to go. And by you being engaged with I Am Pride, or at least with the network overall, you can be very sure around where to signpost them and support them. So it's about being in it together and supporting each other, because you work with people every day. You all have families, you all have people around you that possibly will fit into a different box to you, and make sure that we can kind of include them. And then it's thinking about the intersectionality as well of that, because you aren't just a gay woman, you are a woman as well. You probably you will have an age,
exactly,
you'll have a race.
That person might not fit in, not because of their sexuality, just for another reason at work.
Yeah.
But yet if you like, the label is there that they're from that characteristic.
Yeah.
So can you see where there is the sort of antagonism there potentially?
Definitely. I think the ideal world in like our future utopia, let's hope, is that everyone comes to work already showing up as themselves, that they can then be like themselves and feel fully included for that. And then I won't need a job in that space, and that would be perfect in terms of like making sure that the world is a bit more inclusive. The reality is if you have a protected characteristic that fits into a space that's not included as much at the moment, and there are significant ones in the UK, then you already start at a disadvantage. So we know women in the UK particularly, and probably globally, we talk about this glass ceiling in the workplace of reaching certain heights and not being able to get beyond that. And I mean, Aston's a perfect example of that. We have a C-suite that is all men. We were called out for it a couple of years ago. We are one of the only 5 organisations in the UK still at that stage. And we are working to change that and consider that. And so when you layer that with the intersectional approaches, so if you're a woman, you have that glass ceiling. If you're a black woman, it's considered a glass ceiling and then a cement ceiling. So you've got a lot more to get through because of your sex is an issue to begin with, sex or gender, given how you think about it, female versus women. And then you've got your race on top that you're systemically disadvantaged at because of kind of colonial era kind of setup of the UK and how it works currently, and also just bias and injustice and kind of ignorance as well as prejudice, right? Like there's layers and layers of it. So it's important to realize those spaces aren't achieving from an equal playing field. And this is where we talk about equity, right? Like they come in and they feel equal, but if you're given the same opportunity as a white woman and you're a black woman, you're probably not going to achieve in the same way because you've already got something else layered on top of you. And we need to understand that we disproportionately have bias towards black women versus white women. There are different things that happen in the recruitment space and opportunity space for those people. So if you ignore it and say, we're just going to group you together because, you're both women and we should treat you fairly, like equally, it's not really equal. It's the same as giving somebody who's hard of hearing an opportunity to listen to this podcast without an adjustment for them to be able to hear it properly, as giving someone who can hear fully. Like you're saying, well, you both got ears, so we'll put you in the same box. It's not fair, and it's not starting from the place that each person needs it to make it equal. You need to put that adjustment in and able to get them to start from the same playing field. So we can't ignore it. It has to be raised and it has to be separated and understood to measure it and grow impact on it and make it more inclusive, so that then hopefully we don't have to kind of call those spaces out and separate them.
We're sort of coming back to the point we made or the conversation we were having earlier about meritocracy, and you talked about positive discrimination. Positive or affirmative action is allowed in the recruitment process, but it has to be seen to be fair.
Yes.
And I guess from people on the outside of that process, they would go, well, that's clearly not fair if it's the decision that goes against them.
Yeah.
So it's how you know whether that is actually fair or not, I guess.
Yeah. And it comes down to like measuring that, right? Like in the UK, we understand that if you have a disability, that means it's harder for you to apply, harder for you to interview, harder for you to access the space. Then we need to put in a reasonable adjustment for you to be able to do that. If you're dyslexic, that might look like a product that goes over our website to make it easier to read it. And then when you're applying, to understand that actually their written English might not be perfect, it might have spelling mistakes because they're dyslexic. And then when they get into the interview room, allowing adjustments for that, and then thinking about what adjustments might be needed for them to do their job successfully if they're successful in achieving the role. And that happens in lots of different spaces. You'll see it in the US with university entry and like the ethnically diverse people of colour, like being allowed specific spaces because of data that's proven and backed up the fact that they do not get the same opportunities. So there's loads of reasons behind it and lots of data to support it.
We could make this a 3-hour podcast easily, but let's try and move on and explore how businesses could implement some effective strategies for equality, equity, diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Share with us some of the best practice then, integrating this into different sectors of business. And particularly thinking about the audience here to want to have some sort of something they can use from this practically.
Yeah.
Some ideas on best practice.
I think fundamentally, I would come down to first and foremost listening to your employees, and like this can happen in a wide range of ways. But if you don't know what the employee experience is, you cannot impact change in terms of what is the expected, what is the ideal, what is needed to drive it forward. So first and foremost, listening to the current experiences of your people. Thinking about retention, it's listening to exit interviews first and foremost, but also if you can get them stay interviews, people that could be at risk of flight, but you could save them through a stay interview and understand what is not working for them, what is not like as inclusive for them, and why they would want to leave your place of business to go to another is really key. But then there's like all the other fundamentals. First and foremost, like data drives like how you build your diversity and understand what you already have and what you're missing. So collecting that is really important, and different businesses start from different spaces. You probably all collect gender because you have a gender pay gap to do by law. Most people are starting to collect ethnicity data because soon, hopefully, the ethnicity data pay gap will also come into play. But it's going beyond that. Like I would expect protected characteristics as a whole collected. We know that we collect age because we have to give dates of birth and proof to work in the UK, for example. Nationality comes under the race part, so you'd have that. But thinking beyond that, like thinking about social mobility status is a key one for a lot of businesses at the moment, and thinking about collecting whether that person is of a specific kind of, I hate the word class because we're supposed to be away from it, but like a part of society that they currently sit in. And that can be collected in so many different ways, from free school meals to what job your parents held when you were at school, typical situations. ONS are really good for thinking about where you start from with those questions, but collecting all that data and getting a picture of what your business actually looks like, because we know what gets measured gets done, and you can't have impact on something that you don't know about. So first and foremost, collect your data and measure it, and then measure it in terms of where you sit in the country. Think about, are you leveling up to the space that you're in, or are you falling short of that? And how do you think about gaining that ground and making sure that it's representative? One of the biggest pieces is the recruitment piece. So thinking about how people access your business and enter it and how they leave it is really key. So making sure that there are allowances and adjustments for people that need to enable you to get into the business. Thinking about how you're portrayed on the outside, like what imagery is put out about you, what conversations and talks and like ideas are put out about the business. I know for Aston, if you Google it, it probably comes up with cars and James Bond. There's not a lot about our people. And actually that needs to grow. And that's something we're working on right now, is like our people stories and what we share about our people, because we have some fantastic ones from messages sewn into the leather that's sewn into your unique car that you've designed from the sewers, so that if you tear it apart in 10 years' time, you can see like messages from it. Like, it's so nice, like those details that come in a personalized car. It's really cool. So I think about like that piece and like how you attract people, and then retaining them is like the inner cultural work, like how you build better culture, how you make people feel included, and that's huge.
And what about the leadership and management roles, and especially in embedding ED&I into the culture?
They have to be 100% on board. You cannot drive it without leadership, purely because if you do, then you do it for everybody beneath you, but then they're doing something else at the top, and it just seems like, well, how can you stand there and preach about this when the leaders are doing something completely different? It has to be led from the top. You have to get buy-in. And if you don't have it, then you can gain it. It's not impossible. Like, there's appealing to the minds, which works really well with C-suite, because they want data and they want like analytics and feeding that to them. And you can pull that. There's so many reports, McKinsey and other spaces, that tell you about the value of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. But then there's a feeling to hearts, like thinking about who they are as a person and what drives them, and like why would they ever want to come to work to make people feel excluded. And I think getting them on ED&I training or unconscious bias training or whatever it is. I mean, unconscious bias training was big during 2020, 2021. I think we've moved on from that, but if you haven't even done that, that's a baseline to work from. So getting them involved and checking their own bias, checking where they come from, and where they're starting from in their own situation, and really appealing to just in a person of like, do you really want to come to work and make somebody feel excluded? Probably not.
It's a great time to bring in OxLEP's Leona Weston into the conversation. Leona, is there a healthy appetite for the businesses OxLEP are supporting for guidance in such areas? I know, for example, there's a long-running series of women in business events that you do.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's something that businesses in Oxfordshire definitely have a real appetite for. You mentioned our Women in Business events. So we've had 5 gatherings over the last financial year, over 125 business leaders, female entrepreneurs, female founders. And it's honestly like the best opportunity to get some great female minds in the business world together. The feeling in that room is just like nothing compares. So it's a great opportunity for them to collaborate, to connect, to share their inspiring stories, a real platform and opportunity. So that's great. We've also had webinars and workshops in things like neurodiversity in the workplace for some of our business leaders, diversity and leadership training, all these different things. And it's definitely something that our businesses are asking for more of. And, you know, we like to tailor our offer that way. So, yeah, it's a real positive feeling at these events, and something we're looking to do more of.
And OxLEP generally supports the SME community in Oxfordshire. So we know, where does getting support on equality, diversity and inclusion approaches sit on your list of priorities for those businesses compared to other issues which we all know affect business?
Yeah, so as I said before, there's definitely a real appetite from the businesses for support in these areas. One thing I would say is, obviously, you know, starting out in the business world, we work with a lot of SMEs and smaller businesses, and they're just trying to get by and start off and operate and grow. So a lot of the time they're sort of caught up in the sort of day-to-day running. How can I grow my customer base? How can I grow my business? Where can I meet my peers, other business leaders? So a lot of them, they don't get to give it that time that I think they'd really like to. They don't get to work on their ED&I priorities and putting that into action. So it's definitely not something that we're seeing, you know, all the time. But as I said, we tailor our offer to what businesses are looking for, responding to our business support tool. So there's definitely a hunger there to some extent.
I was fascinated with hearing what Laura's saying there about getting out into the education community, into schools, and obviously with your background as well through apprenticeships. But what about the lack of opportunities for some people due to their socioeconomic position? Are there programs in place to help elevate people's employability chances?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the areas that, at OxLEP we're the most proud of. So our No Limits programme that the OxLEP skills team works on, we work with Aspire and Sophia in the county to try and support those that are furthest from employment or are struggling to enter employment by offering support so they can receive up to 30 hours of one-to-one support alongside interview training, CV skills, application skills, just to support those who are struggling to enter the employment through things like, we work with ethnic minority communities, we work with those who are clinically extremely vulnerable, those who struggle as a result of the digital divide, food poverty, and just working alongside them to give them what they need, whether that's access to digital tools or a laptop, transport, those skills that I mentioned earlier. So it's something that we're definitely very aware of at OxLEP, and we're definitely putting things into place to do what we can to support those and businesses in the county to understand a bit more about it as well.
Perhaps you want to pick up, Laura, on something Leona's saying there, but I'm intrigued as to how smaller businesses and startups can effectively implement ED&I when there are so many other pressures on very, very few staff to keep the thing running day to day.
I think it's interesting though, because I think a smaller business can do it much more easily. If you put it in your foundations, then it should grow organically. And I think that some of the first things is having just some awareness of what like inclusion looks like and what diversity looks like in your area. So embarking on like a free webinar or podcast or whatever it is around diversity and inclusion would give you the thought process as an owner of a business or as somebody leading that business to consider when you're making decisions around like new hires and things like that. It's really easy and quick to pull data around the diversity in the area of Oxford and thinking about what your company should look like. So it would probably take you a few hours just to figure out that. And then hopefully it would just grow organically, because actually if you get it right at the foundation level, the outlook of your business will be broader anyway, because you're already kind of including everyone. It will become more appealing to more people very quickly. It will become talked about and hopefully more successful because of that. So I think if they were to do two things, is figure out the diversity of the area and like what your company makeup should look like. And secondly, just get yourself on a free webinar on D&I and just get some kind of thought process behind diversity and inclusion and what it should mean to your business.
And maybe something you can both add here, because I'm intrigued as to what are the best ways to implement communication within businesses to make this happen. And I guess also where OxLEP are really, really strong is getting that communication between businesses to share best practice. So take your thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think at OxLEP, we're really keen to engage our business community with their peer networks, peer groups, through things like Women in Business. We have other peer network programs just to enable communities and businesses of all different shapes and sizes to talk to each other, to share their experiences. And it might be that someone's done something that's really sort of revolutionary that another business hasn't even thought about. It's just having that shared space to actually talk about it. And, I've not prioritized that. But actually, if you're saying it's easier, then maybe it's something I can implement now as well. So, yeah, I think it's definitely vital that our business community keeps talking and we keep giving them that platform to do so.
In fact, actually, I think it's such a great space to have somewhere that lots of businesses can talk to each other and learn from best practice. It's exactly what business in the community was set up to do, right? It's the largest and oldest of it, like in terms of a responsible business network and thinking about, okay, how can we learn from each other and being partnered with some of the greatest out there. So it's like a small scale version of that. And it's been always successful. Like the more you can learn, the more you can share, the better. What is problematic is when people gatekeep stuff and you can't share it. And it's actually, well, we're all just driving for the same success. Why not kind of share in that and hope for the best for everybody?
Just something you said earlier, that the word bias came up in conversation. Do you accept that even with a diverse workforce, that bias can still be a problem? People bring biases, whatever group you want to put people in, you still come with some bias. Give us some thoughts on how that can be managed.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it comes down to just understanding what your biases are. So there's lots of things that people can do. You can do a Harvard bias test. It's completely free. And this gives you insight into your bias around people, because that's where I think it matters most in the workplace. Like, you probably both have a preference over which apples you prefer, red or green. I don't know. I'm a green kind of person, or maybe a pink lady somewhere in the middle, but I don't really like red apples, but a lot of people do, including Google. They have a bias around red apples because they look like more appealing, Snow White and all that kind of background, right? And that bias helps you make decisions on which apples you're going to buy. If you didn't have a bias at all, it would take you forever to do your food shop, as an example, because you wouldn't have any preferences over the food you're going to buy. It'd just take you hours. And so those biases are really helpful in life. Bias gets us through life. Bias helps us make decisions. So they're not all bad. What is a problem is when you're in business and those biases that you have towards people or groups of people start helping you make decisions about those people. And so that's where I would challenge it, which is why I think a Harvard bias test is really good, because you can be aware of like your preferences. It tells you your preferences towards specific groups, like who you would leverage. And I mean, mine is possibly fairly obvious to me. Like mine was a preference towards people of colour and elevating them, because I've worked in racial justice, right? That's normal. So that's a bias like that's positive in terms of like I would positively discriminate towards those people, and obviously that's not allowed. So I have to think about like kind of dialing that back down to bring it back in line with others. And then there's people that you would positively discriminate against in a negative discrimination where I wouldn't put them forward as much, for example. And then that helps you be aware of it when you're hiring. So if you're faced with any of those people that you would be positive or negative towards, you can be like, okay, I need to like stamp that out and like look at the merit and kind of maybe get somebody else in the room to support me on this so that I don't make a biased decision. I think that's where it matters, is when you're making decisions based on your bias towards people.
Well, as you just said, that can suddenly become a really long process, because you've got 2, 3, 4 pairs of eyes trying to not be biased.
And this is why we encourage panels of people when hiring. Like, one-to-one hiring is not ideal, because you will always have some inherent bias, even if you try somehow.
Some might call that gut feeling, though.
Yeah, some might, but I would challenge it to make sure that it was like based on their merit and whether it's the right add to your business rather than the fit. So I would encourage like panels of people, and that should be made up of people that represent your society. So for Oxford, it's probably one man, one woman, possibly a non-binary or trans space, and a range of ethnicities and possibly disabilities, for example.
Laura and Leona, thank you both for the moment. We'll chat again shortly. You're listening to OxTalks, the podcast powered by the Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership. Please get in touch with the team at OxLEP to comment on what you've been hearing. You can find us on social media. We're on X at Oxfordshire LEP, or via LinkedIn, search for Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership. Perhaps you run a company or organisation that's looking for some specific help, or simply a need to steer to the most appropriate business advice available. Why not try the OxLEP Business Support Tool?
OxLEP's Business Support Tool is here to help your company. Whether you're just starting out, growing, or ready to take on a new business challenge, if you're looking for the latest advice and support, complete our Business Support Tool today and get set to receive a bespoke action plan for your organisation. Head to oxlepbusiness.co.uk to find out more.
Let's speak more with Laura Ayoade, the first ever ED&I lead at Aston Martin, and Leona Weston from OxLEP. Laura, let's look ahead if we can. What's your vision of the future of ED&I within the automotive industry, and how do you plan to contribute to it?
Sure. It's interesting because ED&I as a whole globally is like changing at the moment. I think there has been a period of it becoming quite a fad or a thing to focus on at the moment, especially kind of post 2020. And it's becoming a bit of a shift because there's lots of people in diversity and inclusion that kind of work in the space but have like a HR background, for example, that I actually find conflicting, because HR is very kind of policy and process driven, and ED&I has a lot more kind of heart to it and empathy from my perspective, and thinking about how people actually feel rather than just following a policy or process. So it's becoming like it's changing definitely, and people are thinking about whether they want to keep it in-house, they want to outsource to consultancy, and also I think just because of the economic crisis, some people think it's a nice to have, but actually it's when they need it most is when people are under pressure, because it's when you become less inclusive. So you've seen businesses outsource or just not have one at all, which is quite scary for the world of ED&I. But for the automotive industry, it's interesting that there are collective goals. We have the Automotive 30 Club that is achieving 30% women in the business areas by 2030, hopefully, or before if possible. We also have SMMT. They're focusing right now on collection of data for diversity and inclusion, and thinking about how they work as a collective and overarching kind of space that supports all automotives and manufacturers into becoming more inclusive and more diverse. So there's some really key initiatives within the industry that are really striving and driving it forward. So I am hopeful that all businesses within automotive will be working towards at least gender equality within the kind of next 5 years. I know that's a key metric that a lot of people are placing on themselves. And then hopefully start to kind of look ahead beyond just gender and thinking about the other protected characteristics. And of course, with everybody that comes into business, there is that intersectionality. So you will bring kind of disabled, you'll bring ethnically diverse people, you'll bring lots of different people into space by hitting a gender metric by default. But then they need to kind of measure up those and see if they're kind of achieving their best practice. So the hope is that it will be there. The 30% women in particular, especially at leadership level, I'm not sure if we'll get there, given the 22% currently in the market. But to me, that's not a failure. Like if we're working towards it and we increase, I mean, we've increased already from 14 to 17% over the 2 years I've been there. If we increase up to the 22%, we can at least say that we're on a journey. We've done the work and we've achieved parity with the industry and what's available to us. And we're tapping into that pipeline. And now we're going back to schools to educate young girls into thinking like about a career with automotive or manufacturing and engineering, and encouraging them into more STEM subjects so that they can consider a life that might be slightly different to their everyday subjects at school. So I think when we hit 2030, whether we hit 30% or not, an improvement is an improvement, right? And like we should measure that and track that and say, well done, but let's think about how we continue to build diverse pipeline for all, and take it as a business responsibility that it's not just schools to sit down and work on. It's for all of us to kind of encourage young girls into STEM.
With your crystal ball looking 5, maybe further, 10 maybe years ahead, are you excited about ED&I? Are you worried about it? Just picking up on what you said there.
I think a bit of both. I think like with all things, when things go through like a turning point, it has the potential to grow massively and be amazing. I'm worried about it in terms of, I wish it was regulated. It's probably my hope for it. I wish that people would have a specific set of tools that they need to be able to achieve within the industry to make sure they are legitimate in their purpose and what they're achieving. Because if you come from a very different background and have no expertise in it, but you have something that kind of aligns, because of course we need to work with HR professionals. Like if I didn't have my HR business partners, I couldn't do half my job. They're really important and they're intrinsic to my work. But watching them deliver my ED&I training sometimes pulls up issues because they're like, I don't really get that. Like that doesn't sit with me. I don't understand. Like that doesn't make sense. And so it highlights the differences between me and them, because I wholeheartedly have like kind of based my life in like an ED&I space, and I'm willing to do the work. And it's kind of because it is a passion area. Like my downtime is like picking up on the political issues and the contextual situations that are happening. We are an apolitical organisation at Aston Martin, but I'm quite a political person in terms of like those are the things that matter to me. Like I would love to be working towards like peace in the Middle East and some spaces like that, because of course that's not inclusive at all. And I think that's where my worry is like enabling and empowering people to do EDI jobs that are not fully qualified, I don't know if that's the right word, but like fully embedded in it and understand the kind of tiny details and nuances. Because if you have someone doing the job that doesn't really know those spaces, it's dangerous. These are people's lives. Like my job impacts people's lives every day, and it has the potential to destroy those lives as well. And it's the same in teaching, right? Like it's why it follows through from my teaching experience, because if I choose to ignore a child in the classroom, I completely impact their entire career. That would probably be remembered as that teacher that made them feel differently. We all have those. And that's really important to me. So teachers shouldn't do the job for a paycheck. They should do it because they want to see those children thrive, no matter where they come from or how they come into your classroom. Like if they take away one thing of learning, like that's a success. So I think it's really important that D&I professionals continue to do the work and to like spend time on themselves and updating themselves with the contextual and the political situations that are happening around them, because they impact how people show up every day.
Yeah, no, that knowledge side of things, this is where OxLEP can be a really useful resource here in terms of knowledge around ED&I.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. At OxLEP, we're really keen on making sure that we listen to all our businesses and share knowledge with them that they need. So where possible, we will, refer them to webinars and workshops and things like that. But also we will signpost where we don't have that expertise, and we can offer support a different way. So we would really urge businesses to fill out our business support tool, and we will make sure that they receive the support they need to one way or another.
Let's have some final advice, if you would, Laura. Firstly, to other professionals who are starting their careers in ED&I, what would you say to them?
I'd probably say make sure that it's a passion driving force behind it for you. So you don't get bored, because it is obviously people's lives. You shouldn't be getting bored with people's lives. It's really important. But think about wide-ranging opportunities into D&I as well. One of the best experiences I had was working for business in the community, because I consulted over 30 organisations that were all very different from each other, from governmental organisations to sports organisations to banking organisations. And it gave me a breadth of experience in terms of what it looked like in-house for each different department and individual case, from corporate to SMEs and so on. So I would definitely say that experience is really key. And if you can get it, take it with both hands and roll with it, because I think that can give you a breadth of information. And also it forces you, right, to build your own knowledge. You have to come up prepared. You have to know your stuff. If you're going to be talking to a governmental space, you're going to need to know what's going on in the government. If you're talking to an international space, you're going to need to know their space a little bit. So you're going to have to do a bit of research. And I think that research thing is key. You're going to be forever a student in ED&I. So be prepared to continue learning.
It's a great line. Finally, what are the most important takeaways for a company looking to integrate diversity and inclusion into their daily values? And how can they, ensure their efforts lead to meaningful and lasting change?
I think listen to understand and not to be responding. Too many people listen to respond to things, and actually listening to understand is more important. I think employees would benefit more from you taking away their experiences and holding that for a second and thinking, okay, what's good about this, but what's bad about it, and how can we impact change, rather than let me just quickly respond to it and then it's kind of done, because it's not. It's an entire employee life cycle. So continuously listening and listening to understand rather than to respond is key.
Huge thanks to Laura Ayoade, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Lead at Aston Martin. A big thank you also to OxLEP's Leona Weston. And thank you for listening to OxTalks. There are a growing number of editions of OxTalks available from where you normally get your podcasts. Check out some of the previous editions, including Oxford University Innovation's Andrea Stewart on how to find the right business support for spin-outs and startups. You can hear from James Clark, the Managing Director of Hook Norton Brewery, with a guide to keeping up with changing times in business. And don't miss Gray Laws, Managing Director of Beyond Touch, and Guy Gadney, CEO at Charisma AI, with some top tips for using AI in your business. Every episode is well worth a listen. Please spread the word, tell your friends or colleagues about us, and if you feel so inclined, leave us a review. You can share your thoughts and suggestions on our social channels, and you can email your questions for inclusion in future editions too. The address is on the podcast description. Business support in Oxfordshire is very close at hand. OxLEP is at your service. The OxLEP Business Support Tool can signpost you to expert help in a matter of minutes. Why not take a look? Find it on our website, oxfordshirelep.co.uk. oxlep.com. But for now, from the whole OxLEP team and from me, Howard Bentham, it's goodbye.